check. Okay. So today we'll continue with our first with some examples of static optimization. Okay, we went through how the function looks like, what is the effect of the constraints, then we talk about the methods, and then here is simply to say some is simply to discuss some how do you formulate an optimization. Okay? So essentially, we can use the template of the solver to say how do we formulate. So that's called the optimization formulation. Okay. So first we have to say maximize or minimize. Okay. The term optimization means I want to maximize or minimize something, minimize a function. Okay. Then and that is equivalent to the solver you set your objective. Okay. And then you have to say what to do. Okay, maximize or minimize. Then by changing, okay, x, okay, and then this is this part here by changing this and subject it to okay, and that's the language. Okay, maximize or minimize a function. This is what we call the objective. These are the variables, and these are the constraints. Okay. And essentially here you have what are kind of methods you have available for solving it. Okay. Okay, and on that you have the method. So we're going to go through some examples, not solving optimization, but simply that you get a bit familiar, what does it mean and what variations I might have. And then we go and take one example. Okay. So let's talk about the case where we have, okay, so two wells ESP lifted, okay, in a network. Okay. And we have two wells, but then we have at some point in the well in the tubing we have ESP, electric submersible pump, and then we go and reach, we just put the valves here, but okay, we go to a junction, and then we have, let's say we have two wells for now. Remember the two-dimensional case is very interesting to derive conclusions from there, understand what's happening, and then okay, and we have then a flow line, and then we have a separator here. It's very interesting to put things on a two-dimensional, something that our mind can grasp and we can plot and we can understand. And then we move to a more complicated case. Okay, so here we have well 1, well 2, and we have a function, a frequency. These pumps, they can operate, and frequency essentially means is the the electric the frequency of the electricity, the alternating current, but also it's essentially the rotation of the impeller. Okay, the rotational speed of the rotor. So if we are going to look at that, right, we can say if we're looking only at flow, right, so we can say that the pressure junction seen from one, right, the pressure, this is the junction J, okay, seen from 1 is going to be a function 1 that depends on two things, right? It depends on the rate of 1, okay, and it depends on the frequency of 1. Okay, and if we look at that equation, we have done it a few times in class, we can say that for a fixed F1 fixed, okay, we should see something like this. Okay, Q1 and PJ1. Right, is the available pressure at the junction, and if I have no choke, this is the case, let's write it here, no choke, because if we have pumps, it's a bit strange that we're going to give energy to the fluid and then we're going to remove it with the choke. So essentially we have no choke, and the pressure at the junction calculated from here. So you have PR, you fix the rate, so you have PR, you can calculate PWF. PWF, you have the pump, then you calculate the P out of the pump, and then you go and you calculate the wellhead pressure, and then flow line, you calculate this junction. Okay, so this equation has IPR, has the TPR, has the ESP, okay, and has the flow line, FPR. Okay, then on a similar fashion we do for PJ2, right? Seen from 2, this will be seen from this side. Okay, you reach the junction. It's not squared, okay, just be careful, it's simply well 2. It's a function 2 different than 1, okay, Q2 F2, and if we plot it, will be exactly the same as with F2 fixed. The effect that F2 does, if it rotates quicker, okay, if it's bigger or smaller, simply you have, if it's smaller, will be something like that. If it's bigger, it will be something like that. Okay, that is F2 is increasing. Then we have our last equation, which is the equation of this section, okay, the flow line and separator, the pipeline and separator, in which we say P junction is a function of simply function 3 of simply Q1 plus Q2. Right, and we know that that equation, that function, it's going to be Q total, right? It's going to be something like this. Okay, P junction. Okay, so how if without any optimization, how do I solve this system? Okay, if I set some series, the values here, you know, it's a bit strange, sorry for that, but we shouldn't use the same letters for function and for frequency, but we should use big F. Okay, okay, okay. F includes IPR, and then F is frequency. Okay, F is pump frequency. Okay, so how do I solve that, assuming that how to solve this system given F1 and F2? Okay, I set the rotational speed of the pump, and then I want to see how much I'm producing. Okay, so one way could be to say uh, all PJs must be equal. Okay, so one way could be to say given F1 and F2, right? Then you have an equation that will be F1 Q1 F1 minus F2 Q2 F2. Okay, these are these two. To make them equal, I simply make the difference and square them. Okay, so when I try to change, sorry, I need it. I cannot drag with PowerPoint, so I will rewrite it again. Okay, change Q1 and Q2 to drive, and this equation is F1, okay, Q1 F1 minus F2 Q2 F2, okay, and this one I squared, and if I drive those two, if I change these rates until this difference becomes zero, that means that the pressures are going to be the same. Okay, here Pj1 becomes equal to Pj2. Okay, now I have to do the same for also the junction. Okay, I have for the equation of the flow line, okay, which is F3. So I do F3, which is a function of Q1, Q2, okay, minus F, and here I can choose any function. So let's use F2, F2, and then square it to drive this to zero. Okay, I want to drive all of this function to zero. Okay, and it's essentially similar to what we have done in Excel, that we try to compound everything in one cell, and if we drive this equation to zero, then I will find a solution, right? So essentially, you can see to your model, it's okay. So you have Q1 and Q2. That is the input. Here you have this output. Okay, this equation. How do we call all of this? Let's call it the error function. Okay, this guy is Pj is equal to Pj2. Okay, this is some sort of an error function. This gives you an error. Okay, and then you have at some other point here, you have frequency 1 and frequency 2 they enter. So you want, essentially you can put here outside a solver. Okay, a solver that reads the E, okay, and then writes the Q1 and Q2. Okay, so these two are fixed, these two are not changing, but essentially I read the value of the epsilon, okay, this error, okay, and then I try to change the Q1 and Q2, for example, using any method, Newton, and using Nelder-Mead, using any method to be able to drive that E to zero. Okay. Here we can maybe set the E set, which is simply equal to zero. Okay, so the solver is simply trying to okay, so on top of that, if we have this system, right, if we have this model in place, how can we how could we implement the optimization on this system? Okay, so let's repeat it. Okay, this we can call it, this is the network solver. No, not solver actually, but we should call it the network equations. This is the solver, this guy here. Okay, and the frequencies are someplace here, frequency 1 and frequency 2. Okay, so we have that in place, we know how to do it. Then what we create an extra layer that is the optimizer. Okay, and the optimizer is going to be what is it going to be writing? The optimizer is going to be writing these F's, right? Okay, but it's going to be reading these two rates. Okay, so the optimizer has to maximize Q1 plus Q2, for example. Okay, read Q2 and Q1 and then change F1 and F2. Okay, so this loop that you have here is the optimization loop, and this is simply network solver loop. Okay, so the two loops are the two loops are um, solved sequentially. Okay, for each iteration of the optimizer, okay, one iteration, not one iteration, but the network solver must be converged. Okay, that means, for example, if I use a starting point f1, f2, then I have to solve this to drive this to 0. Then I find my two Qs. Then these two rates are read by the optimizer, then writes to f1 and f2, and then this solve must be converged. So I can use any method, right? So for example, I could use um, for example, if I need a Newton for a Newton method, okay, I need, for example, the gradient of Q1 and Q2, right? So I need the derivative of Q1 with respect to F1. I need the derivative of Q1 with respect to F2. I need the derivative of Q2 with respect to F1, and I need the derivative of Q2 with respect to F2. Okay, essentially, that's what I need to create my gradient. Okay, so that if I have this approach, this is not something, these variables are not something not typically spit or output by a network solver. Okay, they could be done, but it's not a value that is typically output, right? So one approach could be, okay, let me just keep struggling Excel. Okay, another approach is to do the model and optimizer together, right? So in our case, we had that we want to maximize Q total, which is Q1 plus Q2, okay, by changing F1 and F2, right? But then subject to the constraint that is that epsilon is equal to 0, okay, or equivalently that F1 Q1 F1 minus F2 Q1 F2 squared plus F3 Q1 Q2 minus F2 Q2 F2, okay, is equal to 0. So in this case um, you can essentially add this is a formulation where you're solving both of them at the same time. Okay, so you are in a way, how can we put it? We can put it, okay, we have frequency 1 going in, and I calculate Q1, Q2, and epsilon, right? And then simply have the optimizer to change these two, okay, but everything is like intertwined. So it's a different way. You see, this problem I made first the network solver, okay, that I had here, and then I had the optimizer, and then I said for each iteration of the optimizer I have to converge this loop, okay, and then for example, if the optimizer employs a Newton method, then I have to estimate, for example, all of these partial derivative. Okay, and how to do that? Well, I can, if they're output by the network solver, that's fine. But if not, you can do, for example, numerical approximation. Okay. If I put both together, I say, well, I want to maximize these two by changing the frequencies, but now I have to put this as a constraint. Okay. Okay, one comment on this, on the optimization. Okay, let's repeat that. The network solver, network, not equations. Then we have Q1, Q2. Then we output epsilon, and we have F1 and F2, and we have one solver. Okay, who's reading this and writing that. And then we have the optimizer, which is reading these two and then also writing these two. Okay. If I want to make, for example, this optimizer, I can use, for example, a Nelder-Mead. Okay, so I do, so this one, make it here. If black box, I don't have access. Okay, not black box, but if the network model is black box, okay, not the optimizer. Okay, if black box, I don't have access to the d, okay, of all to the derivative with respect to f. Those are the ones that we want, okay, analytically. So what I have to make is one option is to estimate numerically. Okay, so I run, for example, I evaluate Q total for F1, okay, calculate Q total. Then I do F1 plus delta F, right? And I calculate, let's call it this one 1. Let's call Q total 2, okay? And then I say that the derivative, partial derivative of Q total with F1 will be equal to Q total 2 minus Q total 1 divided by delta F. Okay, maybe this delta, to be more precise, we should make it with delta F. Okay. Wait. Okay, divided by delta F. Okay. Numerically the derivative, the gradient. Okay, so I have to make a run with F1, okay, assuming F1. Then I have to make another run with a perturbation. Okay, this value is called a perturbation. Yeah, and I have to make it small compared to F1 to be able to estimate properly the derivative. For example, if these numbers are in the range of between 30 and 70 hertz, so maybe something like 1 hertz or half a hertz will be okay. And then you simply calculate the derivative of F1 as a function of this guy. Okay. Or another approach, if you're going to use Nelder-Mead, okay, or if you're going to use any other, so you need to use, let's put it here, if Nelder-Mead, okay, then I have to have three F's, okay, F11, F12, and F13, okay, in one configuration, okay, that you have these three points, okay. These are three evaluations, function evaluations. Okay, integrating, they have to do this also for F2. Okay, so it's that's why. Okay, so that's why it creates some hassle. If we have the optimizer outside, we cannot use all methods because some methods they require a lot of access to all of these derivatives. Okay, and many things inside the network solver. Okay, so that's why if I'm doing it like that with the optimizer on the outside, I sometimes have to estimate numerically, which can be expensive for a large number of variables. Okay, or I can use another method which is derivative free. Okay, that they depend simply on evaluation of the function. So simply if this optimizer depends on evaluating the function, I evaluate with, for example, 3Fs, and then I'm able to, 3 frequencies, and I'm able to progress to the next iteration. Okay. Okay, going back to, I just want to show you there is also, it makes an important effect. Um, how do I formulate my problem? Okay, so going back to our problem, to our system with two, and just wait, I will show you now what do I mean by that. But essentially, if I have a system with will 1 and will 2, okay, we have this choke here, then we go to a junction, and then we have our pipe. We can essentially, like in the previous case, right, we can look at this has a pressure at the junction seen from 1 will be equal to a function 1 that is a function of the Q 1 and delta P 1, okay, of the choke. Then the P junction as seen from 2 is equal to Q2 delta P choke 2 Okay, and then the P junction will be equal to, the last one is the flow line that depends basically on Q1 and Q2. Okay, so essentially this solver that is a um, network model, okay, that gives me this epsilon, okay, and then I'm this delta P choke 1, delta P choke 2, okay, and I have Q1 and Q2. Okay, essentially I'm trying to change these two Q's for driving this epsilon to 0. Okay, is what we have done before. We provide the delta P, okay, and this epsilon is essentially F1 minus F2 squared plus F3 minus F2 squared. Okay, we try to drive that to 0. Okay, it's the same example that we have seen covered before. That is the line, the system with two gas wells in a network, and changing the delta P of the choke. Okay. So if we're going to solve that system, if we're going to maximize it, okay, if we're going to optimize that system, okay, we can formulate that problem if we had, because we have access to all our equations, so we can say that, okay, we can say maximize Q total, that is Q1 plus Q2, okay, by changing delta P C1 and delta P C2, okay, subject to epsilon equal to 0, right? So this is F1 minus F2 plus F3 minus F2, okay? And also there was one constraint that Q1 had to be less or equal than Q gas max, okay? Like in the previous case. So that will be a formulation of the optimization, okay? That will be if we have network model, okay, then we have epsilon, then we have Q1, Q2, then we have frequency 1, frequency, not frequency, with delta P, okay, then we have our solver, okay, that is simply trying to drive that epsilon to 0 by writing Q1 and Q2, and on top of that you have the optimizer that is reading this Q, these two Q's, and then is writing the delta P's, okay. But in principle, these are nonlinear. This is a nonlinear, okay, nonlinear function. Okay, very nonlinear function. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to try to express this constraint. Okay, this constraint tells you essentially what are if what are the feasible rates. Okay, what are uh, so so that's one formulation, right? We put everything, optimizer and solver, on the same layer, and then we say we want to maximize total rate by changing this delta P of the choke, and subject to the constraint that the network has to be converged. Okay, that is essentially network convergence. Okay, but we could formulate this problem in a better way. Okay, because this is a very ugly nonlinear function that has a lot of issues with the negative square root, has a lot of issues. So we can formulate that as maybe a linear problem. Okay, so for doing that, let's explore a bit what. So uh, let's try to reformulate the problem as a linear problem. Okay, and if we look at, so let's look at the plot, okay, of Q2 and Q1. If we have just one operating, right, and Q2 0, it's like Q1 alone in the network, well one alone in the network. Okay, then we have at this location we have the same thing. This is well 2 alone in the network. And if we run a fully open choke for both simulation, we're going to get a point that will be someplace here. Okay, this is fully open choke. Okay, delta PC1 will be 0 and delta PC2 will be 0. So if I start to move on this direction, okay, now I'm moving and I start from this position, I start to choke, start to increase delta PC1, okay, while keeping delta PC2 equal to 0. Okay. You will see that the line that it describes is essentially almost a linear line here, okay? Because every time I choke C1, choke it, sorry, choke C2, not C1, choking C, increase C2, C1 is 0, it's okay, fully open. Then you will see that every time I'm reducing the rate of 2 and increasing the rate of 1 until I reach this point. Okay? And then you can see the same thing if you increase delta PC1 but keep delta PC2 equal to 0. You will see a line like that. Okay. So this map divides the area essentially in two parts. Okay. Here we have all feasible combinations of Q1 and Q2, right, that can be achieved by choking. And these two are the unfeasible rate combinations. Okay, so if that's essentially what the network is doing, what the last part here is doing, if I assign some delta P, it's trying to find the Q1 and Q2 of equilibrium. Okay, and it can be that I have simply no production of 2 but production of 1. I can have no production of 1 and production of 2, or I can have any combination in between, but the combination has to be in this range. Okay, so if I was able to, if let's say if I knew this area beforehand, okay, and how can I know it? Well, in this system with two wells, it's very simple. I have to make a simulation with one open, two close, one with two open and one close, and one with both of them are fully open. Okay, assuming that these are remaining as a straight line. Okay, so then we can say that then the optimization can be reformulated as a linear problem. Okay, and the linear problem is essentially, just add one more slide. Okay, the linear problem is essentially maximize Q1 plus Q2, okay, that's Q total, and simply subject to that Q1 has to be less than a Q max, right? And also that we have these two lines, right? We have that Q2 and Q1. We have this first line, and then we have this second line going like that, right? So this can be expressed as um, um, Q2 0 minus an A times Q1. Okay, okay, that means essentially that Q2 has to be less than this curve, right? Has to be less than this, and then Q1 has to be less than this curve. Okay, so Q2 has to be less equal than this line here, and then Q1 has to be less or equal to Q1 B times Q2. Okay, so essentially that you are within this area here. Okay, Q1 has to be less than that, and Q2 has to be less than that, and yeah, essentially that's the problem. Okay, so you see now it became from, we could transform this problem from a nonlinear problem to a linear problem. Okay, which is much more simpler to solve, or we have methods more efficient to solve that if we have for a nonlinear system. We don't have to estimate gradients, simply we can apply simplex, for example, and then we can solve this this problem. Okay, I hope the equations are okay. Q1, when I increase Q2, then it should be becoming smaller, this guy here. I think it is correct. Okay, so just to look at that part, if you want to do it yourself, you want to reformulate, you want to work a bit, so I will open it. So I opened the Jupyter file we had for our previous example, okay, of the two gas wells condensate, two condensate gas wells, and simply here I'm saying now I want to drive the delta P of the choke. Okay, first from the maximum to 0, okay, by keeping um, the delta P of 2 equal to 0, okay. So I'm keeping the well 2 fully open, and then I'm just choking well, I'm just here from fully open choke 1, I move it to from fully closed to fully open, okay. And then I record those points. I record the equilibrium of those points. This, remember, is the network equation that I'm solving. And then from there, I'm moving and I'm saying now make the delta P, keep the delta P of 1 equal to 0, okay? But now start to choke well 2. So well 2 will go from a 0 choke to 250 bar choke, okay? And then plot these lines that I find. Okay, so I'm going to copy this for you to, if you want to do it yourself. Okay, and you obtain this chart that looks very similar to what we were talking before or discussing before. Okay, and it's simply using the previous model I had, and I'm interested in when one choke is closing or one choke is opening, the other is fully open, and then when one is closing and the other is fully open. Okay, you see that actually the lines are not exactly straight lines, so if they are they're not exactly, we just put a line, okay, from here to here. See that it's not exactly a straight line, but it has some curvature. Okay, if we make a straight line approximation. Okay, this one looks much more straight. But here you have a deviation between, okay, here you have between linear approximation and the real behavior. Okay. So, but if you add this equation, right? Let's say you are fitting it with a polynomial. So you say that Q2 essentially has to be less equal than Q20 uh, minus A times Q1 minus B times Q1 squared, for example, okay? Then this is nonlinear, okay? Nonlinear. Okay, then your problem becomes again a nonlinear problem, okay? Because we are with the actual, okay? The actual problem, the actual area is nonlinear, okay? But you see, we went from this problem, which is very strongly nonlinear, that we have to solve this function that it's a lot of square root. So simply by doing 3 evaluations, if we assume it behaves like a straight line, these lines, then I can make it a nonlinear problem, okay, which it's much simpler to solve. But the thing is, this case I could do this. I could do this in this particular case because this is a system with two wells, so I can do this only 3 evaluations, okay. And essentially I see that it's not linear, but it's deviating from linear. Okay, it's non-linear. But if I could do that, my will be significantly improved. Okay, so then we're going to take an exercise, and the exercise is saying that we have 5 wells, and each well has a choke. Okay, and this goes to a manifold, and the manifold goes to a separator. Okay, and the separator has a Q gas maximum that it can take and a Q water maximum that it can take. And I have here I have 5 wells. Okay, and they go to the separator. And my idea is these wells have different GOR and different water cut. Okay, so I want to find how much to produce from each well. Okay, to maximize total oil production and be below the constraints. Okay, these two constraints essentially. So if you see, if we are going to this is like each well was producing at a constant wellhead pressure, right? So we can say that for each well, okay, we could say that we have either the Q oil will be a function of simply the delta P of the choke, okay, of the choke of that particular well. Okay, and this essentially it's a nonlinear function. Okay, because I remember this equation has IPR, this equation has TPR, and this equation has a choke equation. Okay, this has all of that inside, and all of these equations are typically nonlinear. It's a nonlinear function. But how can we formulate this problem in a better way such that we end up with a linear problem instead of a nonlinear problem? Am I really concerned? Do I really want to calculate the delta P of the choke of each well? Okay, so let's see if I'm uh, going to add 2 more slides because I think it's good that we spend time here. Okay, so let's say one option is to say maximize Q oil total, which will be the sum of Q oil of each well from N to 5, right? By changing delta P choke of well I, okay, for I from 1 to N, okay, subject to um, in this case we're saying that the sum of Q gas of each well has to be below or equal than the Q gas maximum, and that the sum of I1 to N for all wells Q water I will be less or equal than the Q water maximum. Okay, here the main issue that I have is that this equation Q oil I as a function of delta PCI is nonlinear. Okay, so this makes it a nonlinear problem. Okay, but we really don't care if you think that we really don't care what is the value of the choke. Okay, we just really care about the value of the rate. Okay, actually we said we want to know how much we can produce from each well, and then we can tell the field operator to get to that rate. It doesn't matter if I need 20% opening, if I need a delta P of 30 bar. It just want to know how much do I need to produce. Okay, so I can, so let's say a different formulation, a different approach. Okay, to make it linear. Okay, so I can say I want to maximize again Q oil, and this will be Q oil 1 plus Q oil 2, Q oil 3, Q oil 4, Q oil 5. Okay, by changing, okay, I want to change Q oil 1, just Q oil 2, Q oil 3. Okay, I want to use the same variables as my function. Okay, I want to change these two. Subject to, okay, and I have the same constraint I had before, QGI from I1 to N, QG max, and Q water I, Q water max. But now I have, if I knew what is the maximum, I have a point where I have a fully open choke. Okay, then I know that Q oil 1 has to be below the Q oil 1 max. Okay, and this is a measurement I made with fully open choke. Okay, I simply I did either with my model, I ran it once, my nonlinear model, I ran it once with open choke 0, okay, or I did a measurement on the field. I simply made a fully open choke test and then I reported that value. Then Q oil 2 of well 2 below the Q oil 2 max. Either from model or from field test. Okay, and then we have converted, if you go back from this problem, which is nonlinear, okay, and I need here to have a model or a performance curve, and I have changed now to a linear, completely linear problem, where I have simply, I'm changing the variables, that they are actually my objective also. I'm trying to maximize that Q. I have these two constraints that we can say that the Q gas I will be simply the Q oil of well I times the GOR of that well I. Okay, each well has a different GOR. And the Q water I will be equal to the Q oil I times, I believe is water cut I 1 minus the water cut. Okay, let's see. We have Q water divided by Q oil plus Q water is equal to water cut. And then we have that Q water is equal to water cut over 1 minus the water cut of Q oil. Yep, so it's correct. But essentially, these are a series of linear constraints, okay? Linear constraint, and these are also linear constraints. So the way I have converted this problem from a nonlinear to a linear is simply by making this evaluation of the maximum point. Okay, that is similar to what we did for this case. We did three evaluations where we had one only well 2 operating, well 1 0, another one only well 1 operating, well 2 is 0, and then the other where the two are fully open choke. So here I have done exactly the same. I did an evaluation for when all of the chokes are fully open. Okay, so let's now do it in Excel very quickly. Okay, so we have, for each well, we have this maximum rate. Okay, we have the water cut of each well and the GOR. And then we have the Q oil, that's what we want to maximize. Q water, that's the capacity of the separator, and the Q gas also. Okay, and we say that due to regulatory requirements, I need to have all wells must be producing. Okay, even if it's a little bit, because due to, for example, due to the authorities, they might require that wells must be producing. Wells that are drilled, that are not abandoned, for a certain period of time, they have to be producing, okay, a certain number of days okay. If I see that that well has to be shut down from the optimization consistently in time, then I might consider to shut in. Okay. So now I'm going to put my variable, right, which is Q oil of the well. Okay, the Q oil will be in the same units, and this will be my guess value. Okay, and initially I will take all of them, for example, 100. Okay, going to change just an initial starting point as a starting point. Change P. I'm going to put that. That's the value. Those are the values that will be controlled by the optimizer. So I put them in this violet color, and then I say sum. Okay, this is Q oil total. Okay, 500, and then I have the Q gas and Q water. Okay, Q gas will be this guy times the GOR. Very simple. Okay, and then the sum. Okay, and then Q water will be this guy times the water cut divided by 1 minus the water cut. Okay, these two guys, as they are the objective, I'm going to use another color. I will put it maybe in blue. Okay, so here you have my objective, my constraint 1 and constraint 2. Okay, so let's see how do we set up this optimization using the solver. Okay, I want to maximize this guy, right, by changing all of these rates, right, subject to the constraints that, okay, one of the constraints are the gas rate should be below this maximum capacity, the water rate should be below this maximum capacity, then all of these rates should be below these rates, and finally that all of these rates should be greater or equal to the minimum. Okay, so let's see here. We have maximized total production, which is simply the sum of this by changing this, okay, which seems a bit weird. It is the same variable that I'm trying to optimize. Then all of these they have to be below their maximum, which they are in column B. Then all of these they have to be greater than this one, a minimum. And then this guy, gas production, has to be smaller than the total gas, the capacity of the separator, and the water production also has to be below the total water capacity of the separator. Okay? And here we have to change the solver to a simplex, okay, linear problem, because it's essentially a linear problem. Okay, and it gave the same result that um, you need to shut or to close production from these three wells, okay, 3, 4, and 5, drive them to the minimum, but then you have to increase production um, from wells 1 and 2. Okay, and you see the constraint, the limiting constraint is essentially the gas. Okay, this one is knocking the constraint. So if I'm going to make any improvement in this separator, I'm going to make any uh, refurbishing, it will be to try to increase the capacity of gas. Okay. I'm going to take, that's all. Bye.